Welcome back to Sleepbound. Tonight, we continue our journey through the world of Downton Abbey, where tradition and modernity collide. In this episode, tensions rise as Matthew Crawley struggles to find his place in a world that was never meant for him, while the staff downstairs navigate their own shifting roles. Relationships are tested, expectations are challenged, and the grand estate holds its breath as new alliances are forged and old ones strained. Get comfortable, let the story unfold, and drift off to sleep with Downton Abbey. Chapter 1: Arrival at Crawley House. A fine mist hung over the Yorkshire countryside as Taylor guided the motor car through the winding roads toward the village of Downton. Inside the vehicle, Matthew Crawley stared out the window, his expression betraying little of the reluctance that had pooled in his stomach since they'd left Manchester. Beside him, his mother Isabel sat with an air of determined optimism that only deepened his sense of foreboding. "Here we are, ma'am," Taylor announced as the car turned through a stone gateway. "This is Crawley House." "For good or ill," Matthew muttered under his breath, earning a sharp look from his mother. As Taylor brought the car to a stop, Matthew leaned toward Isabel, lowering his voice. "I'm still not sure we've done the right thing. Why are we here?" Isabel's patience was wearing thin. "For the 1,000th time, we're here because you will inherit a great position for which you are completely unprepared. Would you rather arrive in 20 years' time as an ignorant stranger?" Before Matthew could respond, Taylor opened her door, and she stepped out into the misty afternoon. Matthew followed, joining her on the far side as Taylor began unstrapping their luggage from the back of the vehicle. "I still don't see why I couldn't just refuse," Matthew persisted. His voice kept low. "There is no mechanism for you to do so." Isabel's eyes flashed with exasperation. "You will be an earl. You will inherit the estate. Of course you can throw it away when you have it. That's up to you." "And do you approve?" Matthew asked, studying his mother's face. "Whether I approve is neither here nor there," she replied, straightening her hat. "It will happen." A middle-aged man had emerged from the front door of Crawley House, but hung back when he noticed their conversation. He wore the formal attire of a butler, his posture rigid with practiced propriety. When Matthew finally turned toward him, the man seemed uncertain. "Can I help?" Matthew asked, his tone suggesting the man might be lost. "I'm Molesley, sir, your butler and valet," the man replied with a slight bow. Matthew's brow furrowed. "I thought we were to be looked after by Ellen and Mrs. Bird." "Lady Grantham employed me, sir," Molesley explained, his expression revealing nothing of his feelings about his new position. "Mr. Molesley, I'm afraid," Matthew began. Isabel stepped in smoothly. "May I introduce ourselves? I am Mrs. Crawley, and this is my son, Mr. Matthew Crawley. I'll just give Mr. Taylor a hand with the cases," Molesley offered, moving toward the car. "I can..." Matthew started to protest. "Thank you, Molesley," Isabel interjected firmly, cutting off her son's objection. As Molesley and Taylor began carrying their luggage inside, Matthew and Isabel followed at a slight distance. Matthew leaned closer to his mother, his voice barely audible. "I won't let them change me." Isabel glanced sideways at him. "Why would they want to?" "Mother," Matthew said with quiet intensity, "Lord Grantham has made the unwelcome discovery that his heir is a middle-class lawyer and the son of a middle-class doctor. Upper middle class, Isabel corrected, miffed by his description. The entrance hall of Crawley House was smaller than Matthew had expected, yet still far grander than their Manchester home. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, illuminating the polished wood of the staircase and the tasteful furnishings. It was a house designed for comfort rather than ostentation, though it still spoke of a life far removed from the one they had known. As they stepped inside, Matthew took in their new surroundings with a mixture of appreciation and apprehension. Whatever awaited them in this strange new world, one thing was certain: their lives would never be the same again. Chapter 2. First Impressions. The drawing room of Crawley House surprised Isabel with its gentle elegance. Afternoon light streamed through the tall windows, catching dust motes that drifted lazily in the air. Ellen, their newly appointed housemaid, stood by attentively as Isabel admired the room. "Oh, Ellen, this is much better than I anticipated," Isabel remarked, running her fingers along the polished surface of a mahogany side table. "You've done wonderfully." Molesley appeared in the doorway, carrying Matthew's small leather attaché case. "Would you like this in here, ma'am, or taken up to your room?" "In here, thank you." Isabel surveyed their modest staff with curiosity. "So, are you the whole of our new household?" "There's a local girl, ma'am. Beth," Molesley explained. "She's to double as under housemaid and kitchen maid." "This is riddick," Matthew began, frustration evident in his voice. "May I offer some tea?" Molesley interrupted, either oblivious to Matthew's irritation or wisely choosing to ignore it. "That would be lovely," Isabel replied smoothly. She sensed her son's rising displeasure and added, "So, do you know Downton well?" "Very good, ma'am." Molesley nodded, finally taking his leave. The door had barely closed when Matthew rounded on his mother. "Well, he can go right now." "Why?" Isabel challenged, though she knew perfectly well what had sparked her son's indignation. "Because we do not need a butler or a valet, if it comes to that." Matthew paced the room, his lawyer's precision coming through in his argument. "We've always managed perfectly well with a cook and a maid, and they cannot expect us." Isabel turned on him with unexpected severity. "What they expect, Matthew, is that we won't know how to behave. So if you don't mind, I would rather not confirm their expectations." "I have to be myself, Mother," Matthew insisted, his voice quieter but no less determined. "I'll be no use to anyone if I can't be myself, and before they or you get any ideas, I will choose my own wife." Isabel blinked in surprise. "What on earth do you mean?" "Well, they're clearly going to push one of the daughters at me. They'll have fixed on that when they heard I was a bachelor." "Lady Mary Crawley." The voice from the doorway froze them both. A young woman stood there, dressed impeccably in a riding habit, her dark hair framing a face of striking beauty and cool composure. Her expression made it clear she had heard Matthew's last remark. "I do hope I'm not interrupting," she said, her voice as smooth as cut glass. "Lady Mary," Isabel stammered, flushing slightly. "Cousin Mary, please." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Mamma has sent me down to welcome you and ask you to dine with us tonight, unless you're too tired." "We would be delighted," Isabel managed, painfully aware of the awkwardness filling the room. Good. Come at 8. Mary turned to leave, then paused. Won't you stay and have some tea? Oh, no, Mary replied with deliberate emphasis. You're far too busy, and I wouldn't want to push in. The slight stress she placed on the word push confirmed Matthew's worst fears. She had indeed heard his unguarded comment. Without waiting for a response, she departed, leaving a tension in her wake. Matthew followed her outside, where the head groom Lynch was helping Mary onto her side saddle. He felt compelled to make amends, though the words caught in his throat. Lady Mary, I hope you didn't misunderstand me. I was only joking. She regarded him from her elevated position, her face a perfect mask of aristocratic disdain. Of course, and I agree. The whole thing is a complete joke. With that, she signaled to Lynch, and the 2 horses moved off down the drive. Matthew stood watching them go, the bitter taste of humiliation in his mouth. His new life at Downton had barely begun, and already he had managed to make an enemy of the Earl's eldest daughter. The wind picked up, rustling through the trees that lined the drive. Matthew turned back toward the house, his earlier reservations now solidified into grim certainty. This place, these people, they represented everything he had spent his life avoiding: privilege without purpose, tradition without reason. Yet here he stood, implicated in their world by an accident of birth and the arcane laws of inheritance. As he reached the door, he glanced back once more at the receding figures of Mary and Lynch. Something about Lady Mary's cutting dismissal stirred a complex emotion in him, not just embarrassment, but a strange, reluctant curiosity. She had wounded his pride, yes, but she had also challenged him. And Matthew Crawley had never been one to back down from a challenge. Chapter 3: Below-Stairs Discussions. The servants' hall at Downton Abbey hummed with the quiet energy of afternoon tea. Sunlight slanted through the high windows, casting long shadows across the wooden table where the staff had gathered. O'Brien meticulously cleaned a delicate silver bracelet, her thin fingers working with practiced precision, while Anna mended the trimming on a bodice, her needle flashing in and out of the fabric with swift, even stitches. Gwen was finishing a piece of bread and jam, and William sat nearby, watching Thomas read his newspaper with undisguised envy. Mr. Bates sipped his tea in thoughtful silence. So, what do you think we'll make of them? Thomas broke the silence, not looking up from his paper. O'Brien sniffed dismissively. I shouldn't think much. She hasn't even got a lady's maid. It's not a capital offense, Anna remarked, her tone mild but pointed. Bates set down his cup. She's got a maid. Her name's Ellen. She came a day early. She's not a lady's maid, O'Brien insisted, her lips pressing into a thin line. She's a housemaid who fastens hooks and buttons when she has to. There's more to it than that, you know. A voice from the kitchen called for Daisy, but the kitchen maid ignored it, distracted by a cartoon Thomas was showing her in the newspaper. Her eyes crinkled with amusement as she leaned closer. We'll want some very precise reporting when dinner's over, Anna said, glancing up from her sewing with undisguised curiosity. William fidgeted with a spoon. Are we to treat him as the heir? Are we heck as like? O'Brien scoffed. A doctor's son from Manchester? He'll be lucky if he gets a civil word out of me. Anna's eyes gleamed with mischief. We're all lucky if we get a civil word out of you." Before O'Brien could devise a suitably cutting retort, Carson appeared in the doorway, carrying a thick brown paper parcel. His imposing figure seemed to fill the frame as he surveyed the gathered staff with his customary gravity. "Gwen," he announced, his deep voice commanding immediate attention. "Parcel for you. Came by the evening post." "Thank you, Mr. Carson," Gwen replied, taking the package with poorly concealed excitement. Thomas glanced up from his newspaper. "Have you seen him yet, Mr. Carson?" "By them, I assume you mean the new family?" Carson's eyebrows rose a fraction. "In which case, no. I have that pleasure to look forward to." His tone made it abundantly clear what he thought of the newcomers. Without another word, he turned to leave, just as Mrs. Patmore appeared in the doorway, her face flushed from the heat of the kitchen. "Daisy!" The cook's voice cut through the calm of the servants' hall like a knife. "Did you hear me call? Or have you gone selectively deaf?" Daisy jumped to her feet, nearly knocking over her teacup. "No, Mrs. Patmore." "Then might I remind you we are preparing dinner for your future employer?" Mrs. Patmore's hands landed on her ample hips. "And if it goes wrong, I'll be telling them why." Daisy scurried out of the room just as the dressing gong sounded, its deep resonance prompting the others to rise from their seats and head for the stairs, their brief respite concluded. In Lady Mary's bedroom, Cora stood watching as her eldest daughter prepared for the evening. Both were already dressed for dinner, their elaborate gowns catching the golden light of the setting sun. "But why are they here at all?" Mary demanded, adjusting a pearl earring with precise movements. "When you're going to undo it." Mary turned to face her mother, exasperation evident in every line of her body. "But you'll still try." "Granny and I are willing to try." "And Papa is not?" Mary's disbelief was tinged with betrayal. The idea that her own father might accept this usurper was unthinkable. Cora moved closer, her silk skirts rustling softly against the carpet. "We'll bring him round, you'll see. We're trying to find a lawyer who'll take it on." Relief flickered across Mary's features, the first genuine emotion she had shown since entering the room. Her mother's reassurance had rekindled hope, however faint. Mary lifted one shoulder in an elegant shrug. "She's nice enough, but he's very full of himself." "Why do you say that?" For a moment, Mary considered telling her mother about Matthew's clumsy comment regarding marriage, but something held her back. Perhaps it was the memory of his embarrassment when she had caught him out, or perhaps it was simply too trivial to bother with. "Just an impression," she said at last. "Let's go down and you can decide for yourself." As they left the room, Mary's thoughts returned to the newcomer. Despite her outward disdain, she had to admit a certain curiosity about this middle-class lawyer who had somehow become her father's heir. His obvious discomfort with his new position was almost amusing, especially compared to the eager social climbers she usually encountered. But his presumption that she or her sisters would be thrown at him had stung more than she cared to admit. No, Mary decided as they descended the grand staircase. Matthew Crawley would soon learn that the daughters of Downton were not prizes to be claimed simply because of an archaic inheritance law, especially not by a man who couldn't even properly receive a guest in his own home. Chapter 4. An Uncomfortable Dinner. In the great hall of Downton Abbey, the family assembled in their evening finery, awaiting the arrival of their guests. Robert Crawley, Earl of Grantham, had gone to the outer hall to receive the newcomers, while Carson arranged the servants in a precise line, each standing at attention like soldiers on parade. The butler's rigid posture silently communicated his expectations for the evening ahead. The sound of the front door opening sent a subtle ripple of anticipation through the waiting household. Thomas held the inner glass door as Robert escorted Matthew and Isabel Crawley into the hall. "Hello again," Robert said warmly. "It's a pleasure to meet you at last, Mrs. Crawley." "We're delighted to be here, aren't we, Matthew?" Isabel replied, her voice carrying a practiced brightness that her son failed to match. "Delighted," Matthew echoed, with considerably less enthusiasm. As they entered the great hall, the footmen returned to their places in line. Cora glided forward, her silk gown rustling softly as she moved to greet her guests. "Welcome to Downton," she said with a gracious smile. "Thank you. You've been so kind," Isabel replied, genuinely touched by the gesture, despite the underlying tensions. Matthew turned toward the line of servants, unable to hide his surprise at the formality of the reception. "What a reception committee," he remarked with an awkward laugh. His attempt at levity fell flat. No one responded, and the silence that followed felt interminable. Isabel, sensing her son's discomfort, quickly turned to Carson. "Yes, thank you." "This is Carson," Robert explained. "We'd all be lost without him." The butler's expression remained impassive, his face a mask of professional dignity that betrayed none of his private thoughts about the newcomers. "Thank you, Carson," Isabel said, "for making us feel so welcome." Matthew caught Mary's eye across the hall and briefly considered making a self-deprecating joke to ease the tension between them, but she pointedly looked away before he could speak. "Mama, may I present Matthew Crawley and Mrs. Crawley?" Robert said, guiding them toward a formidable-looking elderly woman. "My mother, Lady Grantham." Isabel stepped forward, extending her hand to the Dowager Countess. "What should we call each other?" "We could always start with Mrs. Crawley and Lady Grantham," Violet replied, her voice dripping with glacial politeness. Cora, perceiving the gathering storm clouds, intervened swiftly. "Come into the drawing room and we can make all the proper introductions. Thank you, Carson." "Yes, Carson," Robert added, his exasperation with the butler's coolness barely concealed. "Thank you for making them feel so welcome." As they moved toward the drawing room, Violet exchanged a knowing glance with Carson, a silent acknowledgement of their shared opposition to the interlopers. The dining room glowed with candlelight, silver and crystal gleaming against the rich damask tablecloth. The first course had just been served, with Thomas and William moving silently around the table. Despite the elegant surroundings, tension hung in the air like a fine mist. "Do you think you'll enjoy village life?" Robert asked, making a valiant attempt at conversation. "It will be very quiet after life in a city." "Even Manchester," Violet added, her voice suggesting she might have been referring to a particularly backward outpost of the empire, rather than one of England's great industrial centers. "I'm sure I'll find something to keep me busy," Isabel responded with forced cheerfulness. "You might like the hospital," Cora suggested. Her comment earned a sharp glance from Violet, whose grip on her soup spoon tightened imperceptibly. "What sort of hospital is it? How many beds?" Isabel inquired, her interest genuinely piqued. Well, it isn't really a hospital, Violet began dismissively. Don't let Dr. Clarkson hear you, Robert interrupted with a chuckle. He thinks it's second only to St. Thomas's. It's a cottage hospital, of course, but quite well equipped, Cora explained. Isabel leaned forward slightly. Who pays for it? Oh, good. Let's talk about money, Violet murmured, her distaste evident. Robert ignored his mother's snobbery and continued. My father gave the building and an endowment to run it. In a way, he set up his own memorial. But how splendid, Isabel remarked. And Mr. Lloyd George's new insurance measures will help, Robert added. Carson, who had been observing the dinner with his usual attentiveness, noticed William's sleeve coming apart at the shoulder seam. The slight imperfection in his footman's appearance caused his brow to furrow in quiet disapproval. Please don't speak that man's name, Violet interjected, her voice sharp. We are about to eat. During this exchange, Thomas had moved to Matthew's left with a serving dish. He paused, watching the newcomer with barely concealed contempt. I will hold it steady, and you can help yourself, sir, he said, the implication clear that Matthew wouldn't know how to be properly served by a footman. Isabel winced at the subtle insult, while Violet's lips curved in the faintest of smirks. Matthew, however, maintained his composure. Yes, I know. Thank you, he replied evenly. Mary gave him a gracious, if condescending, smile. You'll soon get used to the way things are done here. If you mean I am accustomed to a very different life from this, then that is true, Matthew replied simply, his straightforward response temporarily robbing Mary of her cutting retort. What will you do with your time? Sybil asked, seeking to diffuse the tension. I've got a job in Ripon, Matthew announced. I've said I'll start tomorrow. His statement landed like a stone dropped into a still pond, sending ripples of shock around the table. A job? Robert echoed, as if the word itself were foreign to him. In a partnership, Matthew continued, seemingly oblivious to the consternation he had caused. You might have heard of it. Harville and Carter. The lawyers. They need someone who understands industrial law, I'm glad to say, although I'm afraid most of it will be wills and conveyancing and other lowly activities. He smiled around the table, but his attempt at modesty did nothing to ease the awkwardness. You do know I mean to involve you in the running of the estate? Robert asked, his confusion evident. Oh, don't worry, Matthew assured him. There are plenty of hours in the day, and of course I'll have the weekends. We'll discuss this later, Robert said firmly. We mustn't bore the ladies. Violet stared at Matthew as if he had just suggested they all take up coal mining. What is a weekend? She inquired, her genuine bewilderment suggesting she had been transported to an alien planet where the normal rules of civilized society no longer applied. In the kitchen below, Mrs. Patmore orchestrated the dinner service with the precision and intensity of a battlefield commander. Steam rose from pots and pans as kitchen maids scurried to execute her orders, their faces flushed from heat and exertion. Why shouldn't he be a lawyer? Daisy asked, her innocent question earning a scathing look from O'Brien. Gentlemen don't work, silly. Not real gentlemen, the lady's maid declared with absolute certainty. Don't listen to her, Daisy, Anna advised. No, listen to me, Mrs. Patmore bellowed, her patience exhausted. And get those kidneys up to the servery before I knock you down and serve your brains as fritters. Yes, Mrs. Patmore, Daisy squeaked, hurrying away with the tray before the cook could make good on her threat. I wonder what that Mr. Molesley makes of them, Anna mused, returning to her earlier task. Mr. Bates, you know Mr. Molesley, don't you? William asked. Bates nodded, his expression thoughtful. I do. We were footmen together, in a house near Stafford, before the South African War. Thomas sneered. Poor old Molesley. I pity the man who's taken that job. Then why did you apply for it? Bates inquired mildly. Caught off guard, Thomas recovered quickly. I thought it might help me to get away from you, Mr. Bates. He glanced around at the others, satisfied with his retort. And I didn't know then that Mr. Crawley wasn't a gentleman. Might I ask who is serving the savory? Mrs. Hughes's voice cut through the chatter as she appeared in the doorway. Thomas and William hurried out, the conversation abruptly terminated by her timely intervention. Chapter 5. The Village Hospital. The morning air carried a hint of frost as Isabel Crawley made her way through Downton Village. The previous night's dinner had left her with mixed feelings about their new position in the community, but the sight of the cottage hospital ahead rekindled her sense of purpose. Here, at least, was something familiar, something where her experience and knowledge might prove valuable. Dr. Richard Clarkson greeted her in the small entrance hall, his expression betraying mild surprise at her early visit. It's kind of you to take an interest, he remarked as he led her through to a simple ward. I'm afraid it's a case of the war horse and the drum, Isabel replied with a self-deprecating smile. You know my late husband was a doctor. I do. Clarkson nodded. I'm familiar with Dr. Crawley's work on the symptoms of infection in children. Pride straightened Isabel's spine. My father was also in medicine, and my brother is Dr. Edward Turnbull. Even I studied nursing during the South African War. As they walked between the rows of beds, Isabel noted the hospital's modest but clean facilities with an appraising eye. They approached a bed that had been screened off, just as a young woman was being helped away by a nurse. Isabel tilted her head questioningly. Clarkson lowered his voice. Very distressing. A young farmer, John Drake, a tenant of Lord Grantham's. He came in today. It's dropsy, I'm afraid. May I see him? Isabel asked. Clarkson hesitated, clearly surprised by her request, but moved back the screens. On the bed lay a young man of about 30, his skin a sickly gray, his legs swollen to an alarming size. He looked up as they approached, his eyes sunken in his gaunt face. I hope you're not too uncomfortable, Mr. Drake, Isabel said gently. The patient tried to respond, but his words emerged as muffled wheezes that quickly deteriorated into violent coughing. When he pulled the handkerchief from his mouth, Isabel saw it was thick with blood. Her medical training took over immediately, assessing symptoms and considering possible treatments. Outside the hospital, she turned to Dr. Clarkson. Is the dropsy of the liver or the heart? Everything points to the heart, he replied. There is a good deal of fluid around it. You mean an effusion? Isabel corrected automatically. A flicker of irritation crossed Clarkson's face. Forgive me. I keep forgetting I am talking to a medical expert. Isabel chose to ignore the touch of irony in his tone. What will happen to his wife? She may try to keep the farm on, Clarkson sighed. Grantham is not a harsh landlord, but her children are young. What can I do to help? Isabel asked, her mind already churning with possibilities. When Clarkson hesitated, she pressed on. "If I'm to live in this village, I must have an occupation. Please, let me be useful." Clarkson studied her for a moment, weighing his options. "It will take a lot to keep him comfortable," he conceded finally. "If you could look in from time to time and relieve my nurses, I should be very grateful." Isabel nodded, satisfied with this small victory, though her thoughts were already running ahead to more ambitious interventions. As they parted ways, she couldn't help but compare the sleepy village practices of this country doctor with the innovative techniques she had witnessed her husband employ in Manchester. Perhaps there was more she could offer here than merely relieving the nurses. Meanwhile, at Crawley House, Molesley stood at the window of Matthew's dressing room, staring out at the garden with an air of defeated resignation. The sound of Bates's cane on the wooden floor announced the valet's arrival before he appeared in the doorway. "Very tidy, I must say," Bates remarked, looking around the immaculate room. "That's how he leaves it," Molesley replied glumly. Bates raised an eyebrow. "He chooses his clothes himself? He puts them out at night and hangs the ones he's worn." Molesley's shoulders sagged with the confession. "I get to take the linen down to the laundry, but that's about all." "That's all?" Bates couldn't quite hide his surprise. "I'll do this," he says, "and I'll take the other, and I'll tie that, and I'm just stood there like a chump watching a man get dressed." Molesley's frustration bubbled over. "To be honest, Mr. Bates, I don't see the point of it." "Don't tell Thomas," Bates advised with a conspiratorial smile. "He's jealous enough already." He glanced around the room again. "What about the butlering?" Molesley shook his head. "The food's on the sideboard, and he keeps the wine on the table so he can pour it himself. It's like an all-day breakfast." The despondency in Molesley's voice spoke volumes. For a man whose entire sense of purpose was defined by his service, Matthew's self-sufficiency was more than an inconvenience. It was an existential threat. In the gardens of Downton Abbey, Robert walked alongside his mother, their breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. "I thought you didn't like him," Robert remarked, continuing a conversation about Matthew. "Well, so what?" Violet replied with characteristic bluntness. "I have plenty of friends I don't like. Would you want Mary to marry one of them? Why do you always have to pretend to be nicer than the rest of us?" Violet demanded, fixing her son with a penetrating gaze. "Perhaps I am," Robert suggested mildly. Violet dismissed this with a wave of her gloved hand. "Then pity your wife whose fortune must go to this odd young man, with his weekends and jobs. If Mary were to marry him, then all would be resolved." They reached the house, where Thomas stood at attention, his face an expressionless mask that revealed nothing of his eavesdropping. Robert led his mother inside, mulling over her suggestion. The idea wasn't new to him. Indeed, it seemed the most elegant solution to their predicament, but he knew his eldest daughter well enough to anticipate her resistance. Upstairs, in the small bedroom she shared with Gwen, Anna entered to find her roommate hurriedly stuffing papers into a folder. "What have you got there?" Anna asked, beginning to undress for the night. "Nothing," Gwen replied too quickly. "What kind of nothing?" Anna teased. "You haven't got an admirer." "I might have," Gwen said defensively. "Why shouldn't I?" "Don't tell Mrs. Hughes, or she'll bring the vicar round to have you exorcised," Anna joked as she changed into her nightdress. Gwen followed suit, washing with the jug and basin on their small table. How are we supposed to find husbands if we're never allowed to see any men? Perhaps she thinks the stork brings them, Anna replied dryly. She paused, studying Gwen's evasive expression. What's he like? Gwen looked puzzled until Anna nodded at the folder. Oh, he's all right. Don't trust me then, Anna said, a hint of hurt in her voice. As they climbed into their beds, Anna's thoughts turned to the upstairs drama. Lady Mary's in for a surprise. Thomas was in the library when old Violet came in from the garden. Seems they want to fix her up with Mr. Crawley. Well, it makes sense, Gwen observed reasonably. And she was going to marry Mr. Patrick. Anna stared up at the ceiling, considering this. Would she have, though? When it came to it, that's the question. She blew out the candle, leaving them in darkness as they contemplated the romantic machinations taking place above their heads. Chapter 6. Matters of Inheritance. Cora's bedroom was bathed in the soft glow of lamplight as she sat at her dressing table, watching her husband prepare for bed. Despite the late hour, Robert's mind remained preoccupied with the evening's events, his brow furrowed in consternation. But if he must work, it should be politics, Robert insisted, pacing the plush carpet. He could build on it when he goes to the Lords. He trained for the law, Cora pointed out, her American practicality surfacing as she brushed her dark hair with long, even strokes. Well, I don't know what the local people will make of it, Robert sighed, his aristocratic sensibilities clearly troubled by the notion of his heir engaging in paid employment. Cora set down her brush and turned to face her husband. I can't see why he has the right to your estates or to my money, but I refuse to condemn him for wanting an honest job. Really, Cora, Robert replied with mild exasperation. Just because you dislike my mother, there's no need to turn into Mark Twain. He blew out his lamp and settled under the covers, effectively ending the conversation. Cora remained seated for a moment longer, her reflection in the mirror revealing the complex emotions that flickered across her face. For all her outward composure, the American heiress who had saved Downton with her fortune was acutely aware of the irony in her situation. The money that had preserved this bastion of aristocratic privilege would now pass to a distant cousin with no appreciation for the world it sustained. The following morning found Anna in Crawley House, where Bates had arrived to visit Molesley. The camaraderie between the valets, one employed, one effectively redundant, reflected the peculiar hierarchy of service that bound them together, despite their different households. Nothing is out of place, Bates observed, leaning on his stick as he surveyed Matthew's immaculate dressing room. Molesley's dejected expression spoke volumes. Standing at the window, he stared out at the garden with the air of a man contemplating his own obsolescence. That's how he leaves it. The conversation was interrupted by Matthew's unexpected return. He entered the house briskly, shrugging off his coat before Molesley could step forward to assist him. His mother appeared in the hallway, a letter clutched in her hand. There you are, dear. I was hoping you'd be home in time. In time for what? Matthew asked, noting the warning in her eyes. I have been paid the compliment of a visit. In the drawing room, they found Violet and Cora seated like a pair of elegant conspirators. The Dowager Countess, resplendent in a magnificent hat, smiled with practiced civility as Matthew entered. "Good afternoon, Cousin Matthew," Cora greeted him warmly. "We were just saying how charming this room is now." "It always seemed rather dark when my mother-in-law lived here," Violet remarked with a dry chuckle. "But then she made everything dark." Molesley approached with a plate of sandwiches. "Sir?" "No, thank you," Matthew declined. "A cup of tea, sir?" Molesley persisted. "It's all right. I'll help myself." Matthew moved toward the tea table, oblivious to the pained expression that crossed Molesley's face at this further rejection of his services. Violet, watching the exchange with shrewd eyes, took pity on the butler. "So, Molesley, how does it feel to be home again? Your father must be glad you're back." "He is, your ladyship," Molesley replied, visibly grateful for her acknowledgement. "Might I give you this cup?" Violet extended her empty teacup. "Then we really must be going." As they prepared to depart, Cora gave Isabel a meaningful look. "You'll think about it?" Isabel nodded non-committally as they followed Violet out into the hall. Outside, Matthew walked the Dowager Countess to her waiting car, while Isabel had already climbed inside. "I'm sorry Mary was rather sharp this evening," Violet remarked, her tone suggesting that she was not sorry in the slightest. "I doubt that Cousin Mary and I are destined to be close friends," Matthew replied with resignation. Violet's expression softened marginally. "I don't blame her. Her father's home and her mother's fortune are to be passed to you. It's very harsh. Of course, in Spain or Portugal, Mary would be her father's heir," Violet observed, watching Matthew's reaction carefully. He nodded, but offered no argument, which seemed to intrigue her. "What would you say if the entail were set aside in Mary's favor?" "I should try to accept it with as good a grace as I could muster," Matthew answered honestly. Violet considered this response with newfound interest. "Would you? Good evening, Taylor." "Good evening, milady," the chauffeur replied, standing by the open door. As Violet climbed into the car, followed by Matthew, her mind was already turning over this new information. Perhaps there was more to this Manchester lawyer than she had initially supposed. Back at Downton, in the servants' hall, the staff had gathered for their own tea. Anna was attempting to remove a stubborn stain from a shirt, while O'Brien held forth on the subject of the new heir. "He's only a third cousin," O'Brien sniffed disdainfully. "What does that mean? I might be third cousin to the king." "Or a trapeze artist," Bates suggested with quiet humor. "Or a mass murderer," Anna added, her eyes twinkling. "All right," O'Brien snapped, unamused by their teasing. Anna held up the shirt, showing a mysterious mark to Gwen. "What do you think that is?" "I don't know. Milk?" Gwen ventured. Anna sniffed at the stain. "I'll try it with some water and see what happens." She stood and left with the shirt, heading for the kitchen. The quiet of the kitchens provided a welcome respite as she worked at the stain with a damp cloth. Her concentration was broken by an unexpected noise from one of the larders. Moving cautiously toward the door, she discovered Carson filling a bag with food, fruit, meat, and bread spilling out, as he dropped it in surprise at her appearance. "I thought no one was here," the butler stammered, hastily gathering the items back into the bag. "Can I help, Mr. Carson?" Anna offered, perplexed by the unusual sight of the dignified butler engaged in what appeared to be theft. No, Thank you, Anna. Carson's agitation was obvious as he clutched the bag and hurried away, leaving Anna standing in bewildered silence. Chapter 7. The Butler's Secret. Anna stood frozen in the kitchen, the damp cloth still clutched in her hand as Carson's footsteps receded down the corridor. Her mind raced with questions. Why would Mr. Carson, of all people, the embodiment of propriety at Downton, be sneaking food from the larder? It wasn't merely unusual. It was entirely out of character for the man who meticulously enforced every rule and standard in the house. The memory of Carson's flustered expression nagged at her. He had looked not just embarrassed, but deeply uncomfortable, almost guilty. Anna returned to the shirt she'd been cleaning, but her thoughts remained fixed on the peculiar encounter. Whatever was happening, it was clear that Carson was involved in something he wished to keep hidden, and that knowledge settled uneasily in her stomach. Meanwhile, at the village hospital, Isabel sat with John Drake, sponging his swollen legs, which wept straw-colored fluid. The farmer's condition had deteriorated further, his labored breathing punctuating the quiet ward. When Dr. Clarkson appeared on his rounds, Isabel straightened her back and addressed him with professional determination. "May I borrow your stethoscope, doctor? Just for a moment?" Clarkson's eyebrows rose slightly, but he handed over the instrument. Isabel turned to her patient. "May I?" she asked softly. Drake nodded weakly, and she placed the stethoscope on his chest, listening carefully before gesturing for the doctor to step aside with her. "I must compliment you, Mrs. Crawley," Clarkson said, his tone measured. "When you made your offer, I thought you might be a great lady nurse, and faint at the sight of blood, but I see you're made of sterner stuff." "It's definitely the heart," Isabel replied, ignoring the backhanded compliment. "It's almost too quiet to hear at all." "I'm afraid so," Clarkson agreed gravely. "I've been thinking about the treatments that are available," Isabel ventured, her words carefully chosen. A flicker of resistance crossed Clarkson's face. "Mrs. Crawley, I appreciate your thoroughness, but you're unwilling to try it," she finished for him, her voice level but insistent. "Considerable success has been achieved in the last few years by draining the pericardial sac of excess fluid and administering adrenaline." "Injection of adrenaline is a comparatively new procedure," Clarkson interjected, the set of his jaw betraying his growing discomfort with her suggestions. "It was a while ago now, but I saw my husband do it, and it worked," Isabel pressed, unwilling to back down when a man's life hung in the balance. "Please, Mrs. Crawley," Clarkson's voice hardened. "Don't force me to be uncivil. We would be setting an impossible precedent when every villager could demand the latest fad in treatment for each new cut and graze." Isabel drew herself up to her full height, her eyes flashing. "I would remind you we are not talking of a cut or a graze, but of the loss of a man's life and the ruin of his family." "Of course," Clarkson conceded with strained politeness. "And I don't mean to be flippant, but I beg you to see that it is not reasonable." The word hung between them like a challenge. Isabel's face remained impassive, but her mind was already formulating a plan. Reasonable or not, she would not stand by and watch a man die without attempting every possible intervention. At Downton, Cora had descended to the servants' hall, an unusual occurrence that sent ripples of unease through the gathered staff. Her unexpected arrival interrupted O'Brien's diatribe against the new heir. "O'Brien Cora's voice cut through the lady's maid's complaints. The staff scrambled to their feet, O'Brien rising more slowly than the others, her face a mask of defiance. "Were you discussing Mr. Crawley?" Cora asked, her normally gentle voice carrying an edge. "Yes, milady," O'Brien admitted without a hint of contrition. "Is it your place to do so?" "I've got my opinions, milady, same as anybody." Mrs. Hughes appeared in the doorway, flustered by Cora's presence below stairs. "Can I help your ladyship?" "This is the button we're missing from my new evening coat," Cora explained, extending her palm to reveal a small, ornate button. "I found it lying on the gravel." Mrs. Hughes took the button, clearly puzzled by the tension in the room. "But I was shocked at the talk I heard as I came in," Cora continued, her gaze fixed on O'Brien. "Mr. Crawley is his lordship's cousin and heir. You will therefore please accord him the respect he's entitled to." "But you don't like him yourself, milady," O'Brien shot back boldly. "You never wanted him to come here. I remember distinctly." "You're sailing perilously close to the wind, O'Brien," Cora warned, her voice dropping dangerously low. "If we're to be friends, you will not speak in that way again about the Crawleys or any member of Lord Grantham's family. Now I'm going up to rest. Wake me at the dressing gong." O'Brien gave a slight nod, her eyes burning with barely suppressed resentment as Cora departed. The Countess's admonishment had effectively silenced the room, but the moment she was out of earshot, Thomas broke the spell. "I don't think that's fair, not here in the servants' hall." "I agree," O'Brien nodded vigorously. "If she was a real lady, she wouldn't have come down here. She'd have rung for me and given me the button. That's all." "This isn't her territory," Thomas continued, emboldened by O'Brien's support. "We can say what we like down here." "Who says?" Mrs. Hughes challenged, her Scottish accent sharpening with displeasure. "The law and Parliament," Thomas replied with smug certainty. "There is such a thing as free speech." "Not when I'm in charge," Mrs. Hughes retorted, her patience visibly wearing thin. "Don't push your luck, Thomas. Now, tea's over. Back to work." She handed the button to O'Brien with a pointed look. "You'd better take this." As the others dispersed, O'Brien remained with Anna and Bates, her bitter laugh breaking the silence. "Friends? Who does she think she's fooling? We're not friends." "No?" Anna raised an eyebrow. "No." O'Brien's voice hardened. "And you're not friends with the girls neither. We're servants, you and me, and they pay us to do as we're told. That's all." She stalked out, leaving Anna and Bates exchanging troubled glances. The incident had highlighted the delicate balance between upstairs and downstairs, a balance that seemed increasingly precarious as change swept through Downton. In the dressing room at Crawley House, Matthew struggled with his white tie, his irritation mounting with each failed attempt. Molesley hovered nearby, desperate to be of use. "May I?" the valet began tentatively. "I can manage," Matthew cut him off. "Where have I put my cufflinks?" Molesley darted forward with a pair. "I thought these would make a change, sir." "I want my usual ones," Matthew insisted, his tone sharper than intended. A flash of hurt crossed Molesley's face as Matthew retrieved his preferred links and inserted them himself. The tension in the room was thick, neither man comfortable with their forced intimacy. "I know I'm a disappointment to you, Molesley," Matthew said finally, his voice softening. but it's no good. I'll never get used to being dressed like a doll." "I'm only trying to help, sir," Molesley replied quietly. "Of course." Matthew's conscience pricked him. "And if I've offended you, I apologize. But surely you have better things to do." "This is my job, sir." The simple statement carried the weight of Molesley's entire identity, his purpose in life distilled into those 5 words. "Well, it seems a very silly occupation for a grown man," Matthew remarked, shrugging on his tailcoat. He moved toward the door but paused, struck by the dejection evident in Molesley's stance. "Look, I'm sorry if I—" The words wouldn't come. How could he explain that his resistance wasn't personal, but a rejection of a way of life that felt alien to everything he believed about a man's worth and independence? Instead, he simply repeated, "I'm sorry," before leaving Molesley alone with his thoughts. Chapter 8. Medical Confrontation. The following day dawned crisp and clear, the morning light casting long shadows across Downton Village. Isabel Crawley sat in her drawing room, sealing an envelope with determined precision. Her mind had been occupied all night with thoughts of John Drake, his labored breathing and gray complexion haunting her dreams. She knew what needed to be done, and if Dr. Clarkson wouldn't act, she would have to take matters into her own hands. When Molesley entered, she looked up with unusual intensity. "I have an errand for you, and it will be quite an imposition." "Very good, ma'am," Molesley replied, seeming almost grateful for a task of substance. "Tomorrow, I want you to travel to Manchester, to this address," she said, extending the sealed envelope, "and to put this letter into the hands of Dr. Gordon. He will give you a package in return." There was something almost defiant in her tone, as if she were challenging an invisible opponent. Molesley took the envelope with a slight bow, not quite understanding the significance of his mission, but recognizing the gravity with which Mrs. Crawley regarded it. At the Dower House, Violet's drawing room had become the staging ground for a different sort of battle. Dr. Clarkson stood before her, his hat clutched uncomfortably in his hands as she delivered her verdict on Isabel's interference. "I don't want to exaggerate," Clarkson explained cautiously. "She's been very generous in many ways." "Generous? To instruct you in your own practice?" Violet's voice dripped with disdain. Her fingers tapped rhythmically against the arm of her chair, betraying her irritation. "She may even have a point," Clarkson admitted reluctantly, "but it does not seem to me realistic." "Nor is it," Violet interrupted, her eyes flashing. "Put an end to her meddling. I am your president, and I say, get rid of her." "What does Lord Grantham think?" Clarkson asked, seeking some authority to counterbalance the dowager's demands. Violet paused, considering how best to suggest her son's agreement without actually claiming it. "He's as shocked as I am that she's attempting to teach you to suck eggs. Tell her you don't need her help." "Won't that be awkward?" Clarkson ventured, his discomfort evident. "I gather she's planning to stay in the village for the foreseeable future." "No one can foresee the future, Doctor," Violet replied with chilling certainty. "Not you, not I, and certainly not Mrs. Crawley." Meanwhile, Robert and Matthew had ventured into the park, surveying Downton Abbey from a distant hill. The great house gleamed in the morning light, its honey-colored stone and imposing silhouette presenting a picture of timeless stability against the rolling Yorkshire landscape. "You do not love the place yet," Robert observed, studying Matthew's expression. Well, obviously it's, Matthew began diplomatically. No, Robert interrupted with gentle understanding. You don't love it. You see a million bricks that may crumble, 1,000 gutters and pipes that may block and leak, lead that will shrink, and stone that will crack in the frost. But you don't, Matthew replied, intrigued by the Earl's perspective. I see my life's work. The simple statement carried the weight of generations, of a sacred trust that had been passed down through centuries of Crawleys. Was it ever in danger? Matthew asked, genuinely curious about the history that had shaped his reluctant inheritance. Robert gazed toward the house, memories etched in the lines around his eyes. Many times. My dear Papa thought the balloon would go up in the 1880s. What saved it? Robert turned to Matthew, his expression thoughtful. Cora, he answered simply. I often wonder what the good Isaiah Levinson would have thought when he built that first emporium in Cincinnati, if he knew that the fruits of his toil would save a seat of unearned privilege. For the benefit of a man who does not share his blood, Matthew added quietly. Robert chose not to answer, the unspoken reality of their situation hanging between them like a veil. So, it's safe now, Matthew said, seeking to move past the awkward moment. It is healthy, Robert corrected him. Nothing in life is safe. They walked toward the house together, these two men bound by law and circumstance to a shared future. Neither had chosen. Despite their differences, a tentative understanding had begun to form, a recognition that both were trying to navigate unfamiliar waters with as much dignity as they could muster. Back in the village hospital, Isabel returned to find John Drake's condition worsening by the hour. His wife sat beside him, her face etched with worry as she watched her husband struggle for each breath. The weight of impending widowhood and the uncertain future of their farm hung heavily upon her thin shoulders. Isabel pulled Dr. Clarkson aside, her voice low but urgent. We must act now. I have sent for adrenaline from Manchester. My contact will have it to us by tomorrow. Mrs. Crawley, Clarkson's exasperation was evident. I have already explained my position. Your position will be standing over this man's grave if we don't intervene. Isabel cut him off sharply. I've seen this before. Without drainage and stimulation, his heart will fail within days, perhaps hours. Clarkson removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose. The Dowager Countess has made her views quite clear. The Dowager Countess is not watching a man die by inches, Isabel retorted, nor will she be the one to tell his children their father is gone when we might have saved him. Her words struck their mark. Clarkson glanced over at Mrs. Drake, who sat clutching her husband's hand, whispering words of comfort that seemed to bring him little ease. Doctor, Isabel pressed, her voice softening. I am not suggesting this treatment on a whim. My husband performed it successfully on multiple occasions. It is no longer experimental. It is proven. Would you really deny a dying man his chance at life because of hospital politics? Clarkson's professional integrity warred with his ingrained deference to the established order. Finally, he sighed, a decision crystallizing in his eyes. Have your contact bring the adrenaline. I make no promises, but I will consider the procedure. Isabel nodded, relief washing over her features. It wasn't a commitment, but it was a step in the right direction. As she moved back to Drake's bedside, she took Mrs. Drake's hand in her own. We're going to try something. she said quietly. Something that might help. Hope flickered across Mrs. Drake's tired face, a dangerous, precious thing that Isabel knew she must now justify. She only prayed that Molesley would return from Manchester in time, and that Clarkson's courage would not falter when the moment came. Chapter 9. Unwelcome Visitor. The servants' hall at Downton hummed with subdued activity as Anna cleaned a pair of satin ball slippers with breadcrumbs, her deft fingers working methodically over the delicate fabric. The usual chatter that filled the room had been replaced by an unusual quiet, broken only by the occasional scrape of a chair or clink of crockery. The absence of the footman had created a strange vacuum in the daily rhythm of downstairs life. Bates entered, carrying a hunting coat, his eyes scanning the near-empty hall. "Where is everyone?" Anna glanced up from her work. "They've gone down to the village. Some traveling salesmen set up at the pub for the afternoon." He settled into a chair opposite her and began cleaning the brass buttons on the coat, using a split card to protect the fabric beneath. "Alone at last," he remarked lightly. Something in his tone brought a hint of color to Anna's cheeks, though she kept her eyes fixed on her task. Bates noticed her reaction and quickly steered the conversation to safer ground. "We shouldn't be without both footmen. Does Mr. Carson know?" "Mrs. Hughes does," Anna assured him. "She's gone with them. They won't be long." Bates nodded at the slipper in her hands. "So, you see to the girls, and you're supposed to be head housemaid. You should put in for a raise." "What do you mean, supposed to be?" Anna challenged, mock indignation in her voice. He laughed, the sound rich and warm in the quiet room. There was something comfortable in their banter, a gentle understanding that had developed between them over the months since his arrival. Their moment of companionable silence was interrupted by the unexpected sound of the front door bell. "What's that?" Bates's head turned toward the noise. Anna rose quickly to check the bellboard. "It's the front door." Their eyes met in mutual surprise. "You'll have to answer it. Mr. Carson wouldn't like a maid answering the front door." "He'd be afraid they'd think it was a doctor's surgery," Bates quipped, already rising from his chair. "Better you than me," Anna replied with a small smile, watching as he made his way toward the main hall, his gait uneven but determined. Outside, a man of about 50 stood on the doorstep, his clothes suggesting a traveling salesman, or perhaps a clerk fallen on hard times. Charles Griggs' face bore the marks of hard living, lines etched by drink and disappointment, eyes that had seen better days, but hadn't lost their calculating gleam. He pulled the bell again impatiently, just as Bates opened the heavy door. "I'm sorry to have kept you waiting, sir," Bates said with professional courtesy. Griggs' eyes flicked to the cane in Bates's hand. "So that's why it took you so long." Bates stiffened almost imperceptibly at the sneering remark, but maintained his composure. "May I help you?" "I'm here to see Lord Grantham," Grigg announced, shifting his weight with an air of importance. "Is he expecting you?" "No," Grigg admitted, "but he'll be very interested in what I have to tell him." "His lordship is not at home, but if you will leave your name, How do you know?" Bates asked, his curiosity piqued. "Because Charlie Carson's the butler round here," Grigg replied with smug confidence. A bell of alarm rang in Bates's mind. This man knew Carson by his first name, a familiarity that suggested a connection beyond the ordinary. Does your business concern him? It might do, Grigg answered evasively. If you will excuse me for one moment, sir. Bates walked over to Anna, who had quietly appeared in the hallway, having overheard the exchange. He lowered his voice. Fetch Mr. Carson as fast as you can. Use the front door. She nodded and hurried off without question. Bates turned back to find that Grigg had invited himself into the hall and was now standing with an air of entitlement that set Bates's teeth on edge. If you'd like to follow me, sir. Bates gestured toward the service stair. Oh no, Grigg smirked. If you think you're tucking me away somewhere, you've got another thing coming. But you'll be more comfortable, sir. Sorry, chum. Grigg dismissed him and strode purposefully to the left, entering the library as if he owned the place. Bates followed, his mind racing. Whoever this man was, his presence boded ill for Carson. The stranger had the look of someone with secrets to sell, and in Bates's experience, such men rarely brought anything but trouble. In the library, Grigg strolled through the smaller room into the main library, surveying the elegant furnishings and valuable books with an assessing eye. He took up a position before the chimney-piece, striking a pose of casual ownership. Oh, I'll not mind waiting here, he announced, running a finger along the marble mantelpiece. Bates? Lady Sybil's voice came from the archway dividing the two libraries. Dressed in her riding habit, she stared at the stranger with undisguised curiosity. This gentleman is an acquaintance of Mr. Carson, milady, Bates explained carefully. What is he doing in here? Her voice carried a note of concern rather than accusation. He says he has urgent business with his lordship. Urgent, Grigg emphasized with a nod. I've sent for Mr. Carson to come at once, Bates added, his eyes conveying a silent message that Sybil immediately understood. Then I'll stay with you, she decided, in case explanations are needed. Bates gave her a grateful look. Lady Sybil's presence would at least ensure that the situation remained civil until Carson arrived. Though what would happen then, he couldn't begin to guess. One thing was certain. Whatever connection existed between Carson and this rough-looking stranger, it was about to be exposed. Outside in the park, Robert was walking back toward the house when he spotted Anna racing down the drive, waving frantically at Carson in the distance. Something in her urgency sent a ripple of unease through him, and he quickened his pace. By the time he reached the house and entered through the front door, he could hear voices from the library, one of them unfamiliar and decidedly out of place in the refined surroundings of Downton Abbey. How long are you expecting me to wait? Grigg's voice carried into the hall. I'm a very busy man, you know. If you could just be patient for a little longer, sir, Bates replied, his tone tightly controlled. Robert entered the library, taking in the scene with a single glance. Bates standing awkwardly near the door, Lady Sybil perched on the edge of a chair, and a stranger lounging against his favorite fireplace as if entertaining guests. May I ask who this is? Robert inquired with deceptive mildness. And what precisely is going on? Before anyone could respond, the sound of running feet heralded Carson's arrival. The butler burst into the room, his usual dignified demeanor shattered by alarm. Mr. Bates, what are you? Carson stopped abruptly at the sight of Lord Grantham. I am sorry, your lordship. The moment Carson's eyes fell on Grigg, something profound and painful passed across his face. A mixture of recognition, shock, and what appeared to be deep shame. Mr. Bates, you may go now, Carson said with forced calm. Please stay where you are, Robert countermanded. Nobody's going anywhere. He turned to Carson, his expression grave. Do I take it you know this man? Don't try and deny it, Grigg taunted. No, I won't deny it, Carson replied with quiet dignity. I do know him, my lord, but not what he is doing in the library. I tried to stick him downstairs, out of sight, Mr. Carson, Bates explained, but he wouldn't come. A flicker of gratitude crossed Carson's face. Thank you. That was thoughtful. But who is he? Robert pressed, his patience wearing thin. Will you tell him, or shall I? Grigg asked, clearly relishing the moment. Carson straightened his shoulders, as if preparing to face a firing squad. His name is Charles Grigg. We worked together at one time. Oh, I'm a little more than that, aren't I, Charlie? Grigg's grin widened. We're like brothers, him and me. We are not like brothers, Carson's voice hardened. Chapter 10. The Butler's Past Revealed. Anna stood in the doorway, watching the scene unfold with mounting concern. Carson's face had gone deathly pale, his normally stoic expression crumbling under the weight of whatever revelation was about to come. She had never seen him so completely undone, not even during the most challenging moments at Downton. We were an act, on the halls, Grigg announced, his voice filled with malicious delight. You were on the stage? Robert stared at Carson, genuine astonishment written across his features. Carson, is this true? It is, my lord, Carson admitted, the words seeming to cost him physically. Grigg reached into his pocket and pulled out a dog-eared flyer. The cheerful Charlies, that's what they called us. He unfolded the paper with a flourish, revealing a faded image of two young men in garish costumes, their faces contorted in exaggerated grins. We did quite well. Until you couldn't keep your hands out of the till, Carson added bitterly. The silence that followed was oppressive. Anna glanced at Bates, whose face reflected her own discomfort at witnessing this deeply personal exposure. Would you like us to go, Mr. Carson? She asked quietly. You know it now, Carson replied, his voice hollow. You might as well bear witness to my shame. Not shame, Bates began. Shame. The word exploded from Carson with unexpected force, silencing everyone in the room, even Robert and Sybil. He took a deep breath, visibly struggling to regain his composure. He turned up in the village with no warning some days ago, on the run, asking for somewhere to hide, and of course, for money. God in heaven, Robert murmured, the pieces beginning to fall into place. He's wanted for some petty crime, of which he is certainly guilty, Carson continued, his disgust evident. Steady on, Grigg protested weakly. He threatened to expose my past, to make me a laughingstock in this house, and in my vanity and pride, I gave him what he wanted. You did not, Grigg contradicted. I put him in an empty cottage and fed him from the kitchens, Carson confessed, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his admission. I couldn't buy food in the village. It would raise too many questions. I stole. I am a thief. He nodded toward Anna. She saw it. I'd never, Anna began, horrified that her discovery had led to this moment. And now my disgrace is complete, Carson concluded, his voice hollow. My lord, you have my resignation. He stood like a tragic figure awaiting judgment, his entire being seemingly diminished by the exposure of his past. The transformation was so profound that Anna had to fight back tears at the sight of this proud man brought so low. Really, Carson, Robert replied with unexpected gentleness. There's no need to be quite so melodramatic. You're not playing Sidney Carton. Why did you give up the theater? Sybil asked, her genuine curiosity cutting through the tension. He was arrested for theft and sent down, Carson explained, unable to look at any of them. I was innocent, Grigg insisted, though no one seemed inclined to believe him. After that, I decided on a change of career and chose service. The simple statement carried the weight of decades, a life rebuilt from the ashes of disgrace, defined by dignity and propriety that now seemed threatened by this unwelcome reminder of the past. Robert turned to face Grigg, who remained defiantly unrepentant. So, why have you come here? If he's done everything you asked of him. Because he hasn't, Grigg replied with a sullen shrug. He wouldn't give me any money. If I had, how could I prevent his returning to Downton once it was spent? Carson asked, his reasoning still sound despite his distress. Robert's expression hardened as he approached Grigg. There was something coldly impressive in his demeanor, a reminder that beneath his usual affability lay the authority of generations. My dear Mr. Grigg. Oh, nice to see someone round here's got some manners, Grigg interrupted with a smirk. Hold your tongue, Carson thundered. I'll tell you what is going to happen, Robert continued, unruffled. When I have given you £20, you will leave Downton immediately and will never set eyes on you again. I'll have to see about that, Grigg replied, though his confidence was visibly wavering. If you return to the area, I will personally ensure your conviction for theft and blackmail. Just a minute. You will serve from 5 to 10 years in His Majesty's custody, Robert concluded with absolute certainty. Grigg's face contorted with fury at finding himself outmaneuvered. You think you're such a big man, don't you? Just because you're a lord, you think you can do what you like with me. I think it because it is true, Robert replied simply. He reached into his wallet and extracted 2 large white 10-pound notes. Grigg hesitated, his eyes fixed on the money, then snatched them with barely disguised resentment. You'll not always be in charge, you know, he spat, unable to resist a parting shot. The day is coming when your lot will have to toe the line, just like everyone else. Perhaps, Robert acknowledged with a faint smile, but happily for Carson, that day has not come yet. Grigg cast one last venomous glance at Carson before stalking out. Bates and Anna exchanged a look of relief and followed him to ensure his departure. Carson remained rooted to the spot, his posture rigid with tension. I take it my resignation has not been accepted, he asked stiffly. My dear fellow, we all have chapters we would rather keep unpublished, Robert replied, with unexpected warmth. Carson made to leave, but Robert's curiosity got the better of him. To be honest, Carson, I'm rather impressed. Did you really sing and dance and everything, in front of an audience? I did, Carson confirmed, his expression still mortified. Do you ever miss it? Not in the least, my lord. The disdain in Carson's voice was unmistakable as he turned to go. his dignity somewhat restored by Lord Grantham's easy acceptance of his past. Sybil was left holding the flyer, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Robert took it from her with a conspiratorial wink and slipped it into his pocket, a small memento of the day they discovered that their austere butler had once lived a life so dramatically different from the one they knew. Later that evening, Anna found Bates in the servants' hall during a brief tea break before the dressing gong. The events of the afternoon had left them both pensive, the unexpected revelation about Carson casting their own secrets into sharp relief. Poor Mr. Carson, Anna sighed, stirring her tea absently. We'll have to treat him like a god for a month to calm his nerves. He'll be afraid this'll change the way we think of him, Bates observed quietly. Then we mustn't let it. Oh, but it will, Bates replied, a strange sadness in his eyes. The cheerful Charlie's? He gave her a look, and despite herself, Anna couldn't help laughing at the incongruity. For all his talk of dignity, we know his story now. And admire him more because of it, Anna insisted. Maybe, but it will change how we think of him. It always does. Something in his tone caught her attention, a deeper meaning that suggested they were no longer talking just about Carson. The realization that Bates, too, carried secrets he feared would alter how others perceived him created an unexpected intimacy between them. I don't see why, Anna said softly. I shouldn't care what I found out about you. Whatever it was, it wouldn't alter my opinion one bit. But it would, Bates replied, his voice barely above a whisper. It certainly would. The moment hung between them, fraught with unspoken confidences and quiet admissions. Before either could pursue the conversation further, a crash from the kitchen shattered the mood. They looked at each other, the connection temporarily broken. Blimey, Bates remarked dryly. No more surprises, please. They found Daisy in the kitchen, picking up the pieces of a large china bowl, her face a mask of misery, as Mrs. Patmore towered over her. Stupid girl. Who's going to pay for it? Can you tell me that? The cook demanded, her face flushed with anger. I didn't do nothing, honest. Daisy protested weakly. Honest? The day you're honest will be the day Queen Mary takes up polo. She put it down wrong on the table and it just fell, Daisy sniffled, hurrying past Anna and Bates with the broken pieces clutched to her chest. The scourge of tyranny is never far away, Bates murmured, earning a reluctant smile from Anna as they turned back toward the servants' hall. As Carson retreated to the sanctuary of his pantry that evening, his mind reeled with the day's events. The exposure of his theatrical past, a history he had buried beneath years of exemplary service, had left him feeling strangely vulnerable. He placed the silver from dinner carefully into his safe, examining a candlestick with excessive scrutiny. Look at that scratch, he muttered as Mrs. Hughes entered. I'll have to get it sorted out when they're up in London. She peered at the candlestick he held out. You can hardly see it. But I'll know it's there, Carson replied, the minor imperfection somehow symbolic of the larger flaw that had been revealed in his carefully constructed life. Are you all right now? Mrs. Hughes asked perceptively. Only you seemed a little upset earlier. I'm sorry about that. I'm just... He caught himself, reluctant to confide his humiliation even to her. I'm a bit tired. And no wonder, she replied kindly. Did the dinner go well? Well enough, he nodded, lighting his pipe. although they won't make a match between them if that's what they're thinking. Lady Mary doesn't like him? Mrs. Hughes asked with mild curiosity. Why should she like the man she's been passed over for? Carson's loyalty to the eldest Crawley daughter colored his perspective. And why has she been? That's what I'd like to know. It's the law, Mrs. Hughes reminded him gently. Carson's expression hardened. Then it's a wicked law. His words hung in the air between them, revealing more about his devotion to Lady Mary than any declaration could have done. In her, he saw the embodiment of Downton's tradition and grace, everything he had dedicated his life to preserving. And in that moment, Mrs. Hughes understood that Carson's real shame lay not in his theatrical past, but in his fear that he might somehow fail those he had sworn to serve. Chapter 11. A Life Saved. Violet and Cora sat in the drawing room of the Dower house, afternoon light streaming through the tall windows. The Dowager Countess's fingers drummed impatiently on the arm of her chair as she outlined their increasingly limited options regarding the inheritance. We're running out of options, Violet declared, frustration evident in her voice. The lawyers I write to only huff and puff. They echo Murray and say nothing can be done. Or they don't want the bother of opposing him, Cora added, her American practicality cutting through the uncertainty. Precisely. Cora sighed, adjusting her gloves. I wish Mary wasn't so confident that it could all be put right. Meanwhile, we have to watch that dreadful woman parade about the village as if she owned it, Violet continued, her disdain for Isabel Crawley barely concealed. I think she means well, Cora offered diplomatically. Violet's eyebrows rose in disbelief. Meaning well is not enough. Poor Dr. Clarkson. What has he done to deserve that termagant? I'm afraid he's in for an uncomfortable afternoon, Cora remarked, a hint of amusement in her voice. Why? On my way here, I saw her go into the hospital. She looked extremely determined. Violet rose from her chair with unexpected energy, not as determined as I am. At the village hospital, Isabel stood before Dr. Clarkson, her hand extended with a small vial. I have the adrenaline here in my hand. Will you really deny the man his chance of life? Clarkson's face betrayed his inner conflict. I just wish it was a treatment I was more familiar with. And will that serve as your excuse when he dies? Isabel pressed, her voice quiet but unyielding. The doctor studied her for a long moment, the weight of his responsibility evident in the lines of his face. Finally, he nodded, went to the door, and called for a nurse. Can you prepare Mr. Drake for his procedure, please? Thank you, nurse. I will need a needle, an empty syringe, and another standing ready filled with this. He handed over the adrenaline, glancing back at Isabel with a mixture of resignation and professional curiosity. Well, Mrs. Crawley, I have a feeling we will sink or swim together. John Drake sat propped against pillows, his skin grayer than ever, his swollen legs painful evidence of his deteriorating condition. His wife clutched his hand, terror evident in her eyes as she listened to Dr. Clarkson explain the procedure. Mr. Drake, your heart is not functioning properly, and as a result, your pericardial sac is full of fluid. We call this tamponade. I am proposing, first, to withdraw the fluid, and then to inject the adrenaline to stimulate the heart and restore normal activity. Is it dangerous, doctor? Mrs. Drake asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I cannot tell you it is not, Clarkson admitted. The draining may stop the heart, and the adrenaline may not be able to restart it. Mrs. Drake, Isabel interjected gently. The choice is simple. If your husband endures this procedure, he may live. If he does not, he will die. The woman trembled, torn between hope and fear. Before she could respond, a commotion erupted beyond the screens. Let me pass. I must see the doctor at once. Violet's commanding voice penetrated the quiet ward. Your ladyship, Clarkson acknowledged as she swept around the screens, her imposing figure seeming to fill the small space. Just as I thought, Violet declared, taking in the scene with a single glance. Please, Dr. Clarkson, tell me you will not permit this amateur to influence your professional opinion. Amateur? Isabel repeated, color rising in her cheeks. Mrs. Drake looked between the two formidable women, confusion adding to her distress. Your ladyship, my dear woman, do not allow them to bully you, Violet advised, her voice softening as she addressed the farmer's wife. They'll not disturb the peace of your husband's last hours. Not if I can help it. Something in Violet's certainty had the opposite effect than intended. Mrs. Drake's face hardened with sudden resolve. But that's just it, milady. I don't want them to be his last hours. Not if there's a chance. She nodded toward Clarkson. Please, doctor, do what you must. The nurse moved forward with a pad of chloroform, holding it to Drake's face. Clarkson felt along the man's ribs, his fingers searching for the precise location before pushing the needle with the attached syringe into Drake's chest. As president of this hospital, Violet announced, her voice rising, I must warn you that I shall bring this to the attention of the board at the first opportunity. Steady, Clarkson murmured, ignoring her as he focused on the delicate procedure. Mrs. Drake wept quietly, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles showed white. Nice and steady. Clarkson pulled on the syringe, drawing a yellowish liquid into the chamber. For a terrible moment, Drake appeared lifeless, his chest still. Have you no pity? Violet demanded, her voice betraying genuine concern despite her opposition. Adrenaline, quickly, quickly. His heart stopped, Clarkson ordered, urgency replacing his usual measured tone. The nurse handed him the second syringe, which he attached to the needle still embedded in Drake's chest. Ready? The room seemed to hold its collective breath. Clarkson drove the plunger home, forcing the adrenaline into the pericardial sac. For an agonizing moment, nothing happened. Then, miraculously, color flooded back into Drake's ashen face. The nurse removed the chloroform pad as Clarkson pressed his stethoscope to the patient's chest, listening intently. He nodded to Isabel and the nurse, relief evident in his expression. Drake's eyes fluttered open, clarity returning to his gaze. Oh, my dear, he whispered, his voice stronger than it had been in days. Mrs. Drake sobbed with relief, pressing her husband's hand to her cheek. As the patient's breathing steadied, Isabel turned to face Violet, whose expression of outrage had been replaced by something far more complex: shock, reluctant admiration, and the discomfort of being proven wrong. I believe the patient will need rest now, Isabel said quietly, her triumph tempered by professional decorum. Perhaps we should continue this discussion elsewhere. Violet drew herself up, dignity reasserting itself in every line of her body. This is not over, Mrs. Crawley. Not by any means. She swept from the ward, her back ramrod straight. leaving Isabel and Clarkson to exchange a look of shared relief and vindication. Later that afternoon, Dr. Clarkson found himself in the library at Downton, reporting the day's events to Robert and Matthew. The younger man listened with undisguised admiration for his mother's intervention, while Robert seemed both impressed and mildly concerned by the implications. "You don't have to worry," Robert assured the doctor. "She may be president, but I'm the patron, and you're quite safe with me." "My mother was right then?" Matthew asked. "The man's life was saved?" "I like to think we were both right," Clarkson replied diplomatically. "But I'm not sure Lady Grantham will be so easily convinced." "Then we must strengthen the argument," Robert decided, a plan already forming in his mind. "Cousin Isabel wants something to do. Very well, let's make her chairman of the board. She'd like that, wouldn't she?" "Certainly she would," Matthew confirmed, surprised but pleased by the suggestion. "Then my mother will have to listen to her," Robert concluded with satisfaction. Clarkson looked bewildered by this unexpected turn. "But I thought you were—" "You thought I didn't want Mrs. Crawley involved?" Robert guessed. "So I was led to believe. Doctor, Mama has many virtues, but not all," Robert explained with gentle irony. "Which of us does?" Matthew added, earning an appreciative glance from his cousin. "She's been the absolute ruler there for long enough," Robert continued. "It's time for some loyal opposition." "If you're quite certain, my lord," Clarkson hesitated, then thought better of whatever he had been about to say. "What were you going to say?" Robert prompted. Clarkson smiled faintly. "At the risk of being impertinent, on your own head be it." The following day, Robert and Matthew stood together outside Downton, discussing plans for the estate as Thomas held Matthew's bicycle. The air between them had shifted subtly since their conversation on the hill, a new understanding beginning to take root. "About your scheme for restoring the estate cottages," Robert began. "You don't mind my interfering?" Matthew asked, still uncertain of his place. "My dear fellow, I brought you here to interfere," Robert replied with unexpected warmth. "In fact, why don't you stay for dinner and we'll talk about it? We'll send down to Molesley for your clothes." "Better not. My mother's expecting me," Matthew declined. "But in fact, I've been meaning to speak to you about Molesley." "Oh? Would you find me ungrateful if I dispensed with his services?" Robert's expression registered surprise. "Why? Has he displeased you in some way?" "Not at all," Matthew assured him. "It's simply that he's superfluous to our style of living." "Is that quite fair?" Robert challenged gently. "To deprive a man of his livelihood when he's done nothing wrong?" "Well, I wouldn't quite put it. Your mother derives satisfaction from her work at the hospital, I think? Some sense of self-worth?" "Certainly," Matthew acknowledged. "Would you really deny the same to poor old Molesley?" Matthew felt his argument slipping away. Robert continued, his tone mild but firm. "And when you are master here, is the butler to be dismissed, or the footman? How many maids or kitchen staff will be allowed to stay, or must everyone be driven out?" The question hung in the air, unanswerable. Matthew recognized the trap his own principles had led him into, the contradiction between his desire for simplicity and the reality that this simplicity would come at the cost of others' livelihoods. "We all have different parts to play, Matthew," Robert concluded. we must all be allowed to play them. The lesson was delivered with kindness, but its impact was profound. Matthew gazed across the grounds of Downton, seeing for the first time not just an outdated system of privilege, but a complex ecosystem in which each person, from lord to scullery maid, played a vital role. His resistance to Molesley's service suddenly seemed not principled, but selfish, a rejection that denied another man his purpose. It was a humbling realization, and one that would alter his approach to his unwanted inheritance in ways he had not anticipated. Chapter 12. New Roles at the Hospital. The day of the ceremony dawned bright and clear, a generous autumn sun casting long shadows across the village green. The hospital's small assembly hall had been transformed for the occasion, with chairs arranged in neat rows and a dais erected at the far end. Local dignitaries mingled with villagers, all curious to witness the unusual event that had set tongues wagging throughout Downton. Outside Crawley House, Matthew stood in his dressing room, submitting with newfound patience to Molesley's ministrations as the valet helped him into his morning coat. "Cufflinks, sir?" Molesley inquired, offering a selection for inspection. "Those are a dull option for such an occasion," Matthew observed thoughtfully. "Don't you agree?" Molesley stared at him, momentarily stunned by this unexpected solicitation of his opinion. "Might I suggest the crested pair? They seem more appropriate, if you don't mind my saying." "They're a bit fiddly," Matthew admitted. "I wonder if you could help me." "Certainly, sir," Molesley replied, unable to hide his pleasure as he deftly secured the cufflinks in place. He held the coat open with a flourish, a subtle shift in his manner, suggesting a man reclaiming his purpose. "I see you got that mark out of the sleeve," Matthew remarked, noticing the immaculate condition of the garment. "How did you do it?" "Oh, I tried it with this, and I tried it with that, until it yielded," Molesley answered with quiet pride. "Very well done." "Thank you, sir." The valet's face broke into a smile that transformed his usually solemn features. As they made their way to the hospital, the streets of Downton Village were unusually busy, with villagers and staff from the great house all converging on the modest building that had become the center of an unexpected power struggle. Carson and Mrs. Hughes walked together, the butler still carrying himself with heightened formality, following the exposure of his theatrical past. "If you're going to the ceremony, I thought we might walk together," Carson suggested, his tone carefully casual. "Certainly I'm going," Mrs. Hughes replied with undisguised enthusiasm. "I want to see the old bat's face when they announce it. I must try not to look too cheerful." Catching his expression, she added, "Or shouldn't I talk like that in your presence?" "Do you find me very ridiculous, Mrs. Hughes?" Carson asked suddenly, his voice uncharacteristically vulnerable. "What? Am I a joke? Putting on airs and graces I've no right to?" "What's brought this on?" she asked, her Scottish accent sharpening with concern. "Nothing. Except at times I wonder if I'm just a sad old fool." Mrs. Hughes had been adjusting her hat in a shop window, but now she turned to face him fully, her expression softening. "Mr. Carson, you are a man of integrity and honor who raises the tone of this household by being part of it. So no more of that, please." She patted his arm gently. "Now, wait while I fetch my coat." As she hurried off, Carson remained where she had left him, her words settling around him like a balm. Perhaps his past did not define him after all, or at least not in the way he had feared. Inside the hospital, excitement mounted as the appointed hour approached. Violet, Isabel, and Dr. Clarkson took their places on the dais, presenting a tableau of forced civility that belied the tensions simmering beneath. The audience below them included familiar faces from both the village and the great house, servants and gentry alike, drawn by curiosity and a shared desire to witness what promised to be a fascinating clash of wills. John Drake sat in a wheelchair near the front, his transformation nothing short of miraculous. Though still thin, color had returned to his face, and his legs had regained their normal proportions. His wife stood proudly beside him, gratitude evident in every glance she cast toward Isabel. In the gallery, the three Crawley sisters made their entrance, drawing admiring glances from various quarters. Mary, elegant in a tailored walking suit, surveyed the gathering with practiced indifference. "Has the car been brought round?" Edith inquired, adjusting her hat. "We should go. It's almost 3. "I bet Granny wears black," Sybil whispered, her eyes dancing with mischief. "Why must we all go to the hospital?" Edith complained. Mary's lips curved in a knowing smile. "I'm afraid Papa wants to teach Granny a lesson. Poor Granny. A month ago, these people were strangers. Now she must share power with the mother, and I must marry the son." "You won't marry him, though, will you?" Edith asked, a hint of something beyond casual curiosity in her voice. "What? Marry a sea monster?" Mary replied scornfully. The sisters dissolved into laughter, drawing disapproving glances from several nearby matrons. "We shouldn't laugh," Sybil admonished, though her own eyes twinkled with suppressed mirth. "That was so unkind." "But he must marry someone," Edith persisted. Mary caught sight of her sister's expression, her own eyes narrowing slightly. "Edith? What are you thinking?" "You know I don't dislike him as much as you do," Edith admitted. "Perhaps you don't dislike him at all," Mary suggested, a new awareness dawning. "Perhaps I don't." Something about this simple acknowledgement struck a discordant note in Mary, though she affected indifference. "Well, it's nothing to me. I've bigger fish to fry." "What fish?" Sybil asked eagerly. "Are we talking about E.N.?" Edith interjected. "How do you know that?" Mary demanded, suspicion flaring. "Have you been poking around in my things?" "Of course not," Edith replied too quickly. "Come on, who is he?" Sybil pleaded. "It's not fair if you both know." "You won't be any the wiser, but his name is Evelyn Napier," Mary relented. "The Honorable Evelyn Napier," Edith elaborated with a slight smirk. "Son and heir to Viscount Branksome." Mary's eyes gleamed with something between determination and defiance. "Who wants an old sea monster when they can have Perseus?" As they took their seats, Mary's gaze swept the room, landing briefly on Matthew. Their eyes met across the crowded space, and for a moment, something indefinable passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the complex web of expectations and resistance that bound them together, despite their mutual antipathy. At the front of the hall, Dr. Clarkson stepped forward to address the gathering. The murmur of conversation died away as he cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this happy event. The investiture of our first chairwoman, Mrs. Reginald Crawley, who has graciously agreed to share the duties of our beloved President, the Dowager Countess of Grantham. Violet sat ramrod straight, her expression betraying nothing of her inner fury. Beside her, Isabel's face wore a smile of triumph, carefully tempered by public decorum. Our little hospital must surely grow and thrive, Clarkson continued. With two such doughty champions united as they are by the strongest ties of all, family and friendship. The irony of his final words was lost on no one, least of all the two women in question, who glared at each other with thinly disguised loathing. Robert caught Cora's eye across the room, his expression both amused and slightly guilty. She tilted her head questioningly. "Why are you doing this?" she mouthed. "And why so many witnesses? Is it just to punish your mother?" "Not punish," he replied quietly. "I'd say it was to teach her a lesson." As applause filled the hall, the dynamics of Downton shifted once more. Old alliances reformed, new ones tentatively emerged, and the intricate dance of power and position continued its eternal rhythm. The great house stood as it always had, solid and unchanging against the Yorkshire sky, while inside its walls and within the village it dominated, the winds of change blew ever stronger. For Matthew Crawley, reluctant heir to this complex world, the past weeks had brought unexpected lessons in humility, in understanding, and in the recognition that tradition and progress need not always stand opposed. As he joined in the polite applause, his gaze moved from his mother's triumphant face to the magnificent edifice of Downton, visible through the hospital windows. Perhaps there was a place for him here after all, not as a replacement for what had come before, but as part of its ongoing story. And for Mary Crawley, watching with guarded eyes as her grandmother endured this public diminishment, the future remained uncertain but full of possibility. Perseus might yet appear on the horizon, rescuing her from the fate that seemed increasingly inevitable. But something in her had shifted since Matthew's arrival, a recognition that the sea monster, as she had so cruelly labeled him, possessed qualities she had not initially perceived, not that she would ever admit as much, even to herself. The ceremony concluded with refreshments served in the hospital garden. As the attendees dispersed into small conversational groups, the social hierarchies reasserted themselves, the Crawleys and their circle, the professional classes represented by Dr. Clarkson and the local solicitor. The servants gathered discreetly near the gate. Yet boundaries that had once seemed impermeable now showed signs of flexibility, with Isabel moving comfortably between groups, and even Carson unbending enough to accept a glass of punch from Mrs. Hughes, with something approaching a smile. Change had come to Downton, as it inevitably would. The only question remaining was whether this proud household would bend with the winds of transformation or break beneath their gathering force. For now, at least, the ancient walls stood firm, sheltering within them the complex lives of those who called Downton home. Upstairs and down, aristocrat and servant, traditionalist and reformer, all bound together in the great tapestry of a world on the cusp of irrevocable change. Thanks so much for joining me tonight. I hope this story has brought you a little peace and relaxation. As always, feel free to drift off whenever you're ready.
Did I make the most of loving you? So many things we didn't do. Did I give you all my heart could give? 2 unlived lives with lives to live. When these endless lonely days are through, I'll make the most of loving you. I'll make the most of loving you. Did we make the most of all we had? Not seeing you makes my heart sad. Did we make the most of summer days? We still have time to change our ways. When these endless lonely days are through, I'll make the most of loving you. 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 Did those tender words stay in my head? So many things were left unsaid. Did I give you all my heart could give? To unlived lives with lives to live. When these endless lonely days are through, I'll make the most of loving you. I'll make the most of loving you. I'll make the most of loving you. I'll make the most of loving you.